welcome to Thursday of our Bake Your Way Through Holy Week. Yesterday we were making our peanut butter Cheerio clusters, so I really hope that you enjoyed them, and they were definitely a hit in our household. Today is Maundy Thursday, which is an important day in Holy Week because it's the day that Jesus had his last supper, his last meal with his friends. And the likelihood is that because Jesus was Jewish, that meal was a Passover meal. Passover is a very important festival for the Jews because it remembers when God's people were released from slavery in Egypt. The way that the Jews celebrate the Passover is with a Seder meal, and some Christians will choose to kind of reenact that meal to help us to understand and experience more of what Jesus was going through. One of the things that is eaten at a Seder meal is a mixture called Charoset, which is an apple-based mixture. So our baking today is going to be apple-based, which is very exciting. So the mixture itself is a mixture of apples, walnuts, honey, and cinnamon, and it kind of it forms a brown sticky mess, which sort of reminds us of the mortar and clay bricks that the Israelites worked with when they were slaves in Egypt. So it's a really tasty mixture, but may not look the most appetizing. But the Passover that we're remembering is way back in the book of Exodus in the Bible, when God put the 10 plagues on Egypt to persuade Pharaoh to let his people go from where they're being kept slaves. So they were led out of Egypt by Moses, but they had to leave very quickly, so they didn't have time to make bread properly, and they had a lamb which they shared, and they made bread without yeast. And that lamb is often used at Easter, so you may be familiar with lamb, but this Charoset maybe isn't used quite so much. So we're going to need, I've got all my ingredients ready. I've got 2 apples that are chopped up in this bowl. I've got 50 grams of, I've got pecans because I have them in my cupboard already, but walnuts would be really good as well. If you have a nut allergy, don't put the nuts in. If you don't like walnuts, use pecans. If you don't like pecans, use walnuts. Whatever nuts you have, 50 grams chopped quite finely as well. I've got 75 grams of honey in a little pot here. And I've got my cinnamon ready to use, and I'll do that as I go along. Things like cinnamon, you can use other spices, nutmeg, that kind of sweet thing, and then just do it according to taste. If you're not a big fan of it, maybe just put a tiny bit to flavour the apples. If you love cinnamon, then make it as much cinnamon as you want. The other thing I've got here ready is 1 egg that's been beaten up to make an egg wash when we use our pastry. So a word on pastry. Now I have a toddler who doesn't give me much time to do long things, so I have bought ready-rolled puff pastry to be a bit of a cheat. The best thing that you could do is to make your own puff pastry. I'm going to put a recipe at the end of this video. So to make puff pastry, it involves making a dough and then freezing butter, grating it on, folding, rolling, repeating the process so you've got lots of nice layers for the puff in the pastry when it's ready to bake. It can be quite hard work, which is why I'm not going to be able to do it today, but it's a really good thing if you do have an opportunity because it helps us to reflect on the hard work and the labour that the Israelites had to go through when they were in Egypt, which of course is really important to put in the context of why the rescue from Egypt was so important. So I'm cheating with my pre-rolled pastry here. If you do get a chance to make puff pastry, check out the instructions at the end of the video and go ahead from there. That would be great. So I'm just going to be making the Charoset for us today. So I'm going to start off just putting all the ingredients into a bowl. So they're going to be chopped apples. Now they are chopped quite finely because they're going to be in sort of turnover style pastry, so you don't want them to be taking up too much room. There goes my nuts. Just going to give them a very gentle stir around, mix them together. Add in my honey. So the honey is what's going to kind of bind everything together and give it that gooey, muddy look. That is what was so important to remember today. So while this is happening, my oven is preheating, by the way. It needs to be on 200 degrees. So if you have an oven, then get it preheated to 200, because we're going to be needing that to actually bake them in a moment. And before I mix it, I'm going to put in cinnamon. Now, I quite like cinnamon, so I'm going to go quite heavy on it. But obviously, you just put in as much as you like. So we're going to mix that together. And it's the cinnamon, the brown cinnamon, that's going to give it that muddy appearance, which is what we're after. Now, it's not very much mixing. They're quite big ingredients. They'll go together. Just making sure that honey is spread around as much as possible. And if you haven't got, you can put more honey in, less honey. This is a really flexible recipe, so put in as much or as little of the ingredients as you would like to, and that's absolutely fine. Right. So the next thing I'm going to need to do is prepare my pastry. So it's already rolled out, which is useful, but I'm not going to be making one massive turnover. I'm going to be making them into smaller pieces. So I'm going to cut these into squares, and to do that, I'm just going to cut that in half, and then use my nice sharp knife to, I think this is probably going to make 6 for this pastry. So they are roughly square there, which is what you need because you're going to be folding them up. So yeah, you need to be square shaped. If you've made your own pastry with the ingredients that are at the end of the video, you may be able to get more than this, but for my pre-rolled sheet like this one, we're just going to do 6. So I might end up with some left over actually, which is absolutely fine. So the first thing we need to do is brush the pastry with the egg wash here. I've got a nice pastry brush, which is useful, and that's going to help it stick together when you come to fold it over. So we need to make sure it goes out all the way to the edges, because it's the edges that are the bits that are really going to need to stick. I'm just going to do it all in one go to make it a little bit easier. Egg wash can be a bit messy, because that's what eggs do. It doesn't need to be very, very well beaten, just enough that the bits are combined so that you don't end up with random bits of egg and yolk everywhere. So brushing that out. Okay, now if you do use the pre-bought pastry as well, then just be careful when you roll it out. It needs to come out of the fridge for a few minutes before you do, otherwise it's too inflexible. But you need to make sure that you roll it out very carefully, otherwise you end up with tears in it, which you don't want. So that's the egg wash. And then what we're going to do is put some apple into the middle of the pastry. I'm not sure how much we need, so it's going to be a trial and error as we go along. And then we're going to fold the pastry over diagonally like that. That might be a little bit too much apple, so I'm going to put it into the next square there to even it out. And then pop the edges together. Now I'm going to move these onto my baking sheet to finish them up because I think they're going to be too close. So for my baking sheet, I'm just going to put the baking paper on there too, so I can pick up very carefully my completed square, make sure the apple mixture's in, and then you need a bit of a gap with the edges because you need to push the edges together to seal them up. So I'm going to start off doing it with my fingers so that I know that they've been pinched together, and then when I put it down on the plate, I can use a fork to crimp around the edges so it gives it a nice crimped effect and make sure that it's really well pushed together. So I'm going to repeat that for all 6 of my squares, and then I'll give you the next instructions. Okay, so when you're pressing down with the fork, make sure you don't press too hard. You just want to be pinching it together, not tearing through the pastry. You don't want to be too heavy-handed. Now, before these go in the oven, we've just got a couple more things we need to do. The first is to prick a little hole in each one with a knife, just to make sure that the steam from the cooking apples can escape. Otherwise, you're going to end up with some very funny pastry creations. And the last thing is going to brush it with some egg wash. You can also use milk for this bit, and that's going to help it go brown on top. So it doesn't make any difference to its taste, but it does make it look really nice. A lot more appetizing than your white pastry. So we're just going to pop some of that on. There we go. Make the most of that egg that we did earlier, isn't it? So you need to be really careful when you're doing it. You don't put too much filling in each of the turnovers. So it might take a bit of trial and error to work out how much you can fit into yours, depending how big your squares are. You don't want them to be overfilled, because then they're really difficult to seal up and will end up spilling over. The other thing to be aware of is be really careful when you cut the pastry to make sure that it is into squares and not rectangles, because you're folding it in half diagonally, you really need it to be even, otherwise you're going to end up with a funny edge, which is a bit what my last one did. I had to kind of scrape it together in a creative way. So some egg wash on all of them. The last thing that I'm going to do is to sprinkle a bit of brown sugar over the top, just so it gives it that kind of crispy bit at the end. Again, this isn't something that you have to do. You could do it with castor, you could do it with demerara. I've just got some brown sugar sitting around, which was already opened. It's probably a little bit heavy-handed with the brown sugar, but we're just going to do a little bit with them. And with this one, so it clumps together, whereas if you use demerara or castor, they're in bigger grains, so they won't clump together quite so much. So those are my turnovers ready to go into the oven. So they're going to go in at 200 degrees for 20 to 25 minutes. And I'm going to keep an eye on them to make sure they don't burn, so you can want them nice and brown and golden on top. So when they come out of the oven, you don't have to do anything else to them, just leave them to cool, because otherwise they'll be very hot when you bite into them. But we can eat them as free people, as the Egyptians eventually, as the Hebrews were when they left Egypt, maybe reclining on our left side when we do, because that's a mark of a free person. There's only free people. Only non-slaves were allowed to eat reclining in ancient Israel. There's some very strange traditions a long time ago, but that's one of those things. But the whole point is we can eat them celebrating that we are free, and we can have joy in our hearts knowing that freedom is coming for all of God's people. As we come towards Easter, then that freedom takes on a whole new dimension when we remember what Jesus did on Easter and what his sacrifice meant for us. And we'll be thinking of that in a couple of days now. Now tomorrow, join us again, we are going to be making some hot cross buns. Hot cross buns is going to be a longer bake than the previous videos, because it's a dough that needs yeast to rise. You're going to need to allow some time in between each stage of the baking to be able to make them. So don't start baking last thing at night is the point there. It doesn't have to be something you stay in all day for, they can leave gaps in between. But just to bear in mind, if you're joining us tomorrow, we're making hot cross buns for Good Friday, so it's going to take a little bit longer. All right, we'll see you tomorrow then. Bye.